LBS, location-based services and Google Maps, and how to build a world business in maps. So we have Dave here, who's a principal at Lightspeed Venture Partners. So he'll be moderating the session. So on to you, Dave.
Okay. No, I got it, Mike. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. I wanted to introduce Manik Gupta from Google. Maybe you take a sentence or two to introduce yourself.
You were supposed to. Testing. Can you guys hear me at the back? Yes. Okay, thanks. So yeah, hi, I'm Manik Gupta. I'm a group product manager with the Google Maps team based in the US. Been with Google for about 5 years, been only focused on maps throughout. Used to manage maps in India until 2011, and then now I have a portfolio of maps and local and API-related efforts that I'm involved with back in Mountain View.
So we'll talk about sort of where maps are going overall, and then we'll talk about, from a very developer-focused viewpoint, about what are the new types of applications and companies that can be built on top of maps going forward. And he'll talk about some of the new APIs that are coming out, competitive landscape in maps, and some of the new platforms that we're seeing these sorts of applications come out on. So maybe at the end of this, you'll have an idea, a few ideas about new apps and services that you could potentially build in the future. Just a show of hands, how many of you are developers? Okay, about 30%. And how many of you have developed on maps, any maps API? Okay, good. And how many of you are entrepreneurs? Many more. Okay, good, great. So we'll focus our thoughts on that. So maybe I can start out with a sort of overview of where maps have come from and where they're going. I've been involved in mobile for 15 years. Manik has been involved with Google Maps intimately. So we have a viewpoint here. And Manik, in 2007, TomTom and Navteq got acquired for several $billion each. And then 2008, you had the crash, and we all thought that those valuations post facto seemed very high. But there are only a few map companies out there, map database companies out there. So maybe take us through the history of that a little bit. Who's out there today? Where does it come from? And what happens when you have such a scarcity of map providers? What happens to these companies? What platform companies want to acquire them or want to own them?
Yep. So let's start with both TomTom and Navteq, right? So both great companies. They invested heavily over several years, and they built a fairly good, global coverage for their map data. See, one of the things that you all have to understand is that creating maps is very, very hard. It's a very operational business because you're basically modeling the world you're trying to model the real world. So you can't just say, let's just estimate that there is a road here and this is some random name and stuff like that. You actually have to have a way to kind of get the real world information and put that into a digital format. So map making is generally a very hard business to be in. So TomTom and Navteq, both great companies, they did that very successfully, and then they got acquired, by bigger companies and so on. What has happened in the last few years is there are a few companies, Google being one of them, Apple being another one of them. They have started to think about maps as a very integral strategic asset. And the reason is because as the internet technologies have evolved, the concept of location, user location, is actually very, very important for a lot of the experiences that get built. So how do you locate a user, and you sort of convert that into a latitude, longitude, but then you need to put that latitude, longitude on top of a map that gives the understanding of where the user is, which place is he in, which road is he driving on and stuff like that. So, way back in around 2007, 2008, for Google, we actually started a project called Ground Truth. And we decided that we are going to build maps ourselves. And the reason is because we wanted to have complete ownership of our own data. And in a way, sort of, if users had any issues with our data, they can actually point the finger to us, as opposed to saying, hey, well, Google, just give them a break because they license this data from some other company. So we decided to build map data from scratch, and we went country by country. We got data sources. We had Street View driving in many countries. So we used those cars as our survey cars, if you will. Picked up all that information, mashed it all together, and then launched maps in various countries. So fast forward to 2013, we have Ground Truth launched in many, many countries around the world, and our map data is actually completely owned by Google, and it's something which we feel very happy about because now we have the ability to essentially reflect any changes to our data in a matter of minutes on maps. Earlier, it used to take time because imagine, you're waiting for a provider to give you the feed, and then that feed needs to be integrated, and all of you who are developers here, you understand, right? Merging stuff in databases and all is very hard, and then once you do that, then you're basically able to reflect that on the user platform.
So Manik, if I could interject for a second, when I read Navtech's public statements before they got acquired, they said something like they spent $400 million a year driving these vans around and processing all this information, and that was 2007.
Yep.
So I can imagine that you could be near $1 billion today to support these sorts of efforts out there. Describe perhaps for the audience a little bit the layers of sort of the map universe from the sort of core database upwards.
Sure. So the way we think about maps is it's basically a layered topology. You have to be accurate to be, to really make sense for the user. And again, on top of that, there is a lot of enterprise kind of cases. So there are companies out there today who basically want to take a lot of their geospatial data and they want to put that into the cloud using Google services or other services as well. So that's the other sort of a private version of the layer, if you will. And on top of all that is a user, right? So a user who's interacting with these services using your apps and so on, he's right on top and he's able to, basically transact and get the location information back and make sense from there. So just to add to, close the other part. So that's kind of what Google did, right? So we built our own maps and we continue to invest in that and so on and so forth. Similarly, of course, Apple has also done that. They've launched their Maps product last year. They are licensing their data from TomTom, which is TeleAtlas, and they're also doing this globally with many other companies. Microsoft licenses their data primarily from Navtech, which is erstwhile Nokia. So these are the platform providers that are, to answer your question, they are the ones who are basically investing heavily into creating these stacks, which developers and users and enterprise folks can then use to build their applications.
And then we've got OpenStreetMap and other initiatives which are sort of user-generated content that in some countries like Germany have reached sort of very sort of high-quality points where you can actually navigate using those maps. For some reason, Germany, even for Wikipedia, was one of the first markets that they got real traction in. The Germans were very meticulous about marking benches and electricity lines and all sorts of things. So that's an interesting sort of user-generated piece. Let's move a little bit to Google Maps and APIs itself, and maybe give some stats on that side.
Sure. So APIs, broadly speaking, I noticed that there are very few hands in the audience, so maybe I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So APIs, broadly speaking, you can. Our Maps API comes in two flavors, right? So you have the free version, which developers use a lot of time. We have more than 1 million developers who use Maps API today. And then you have the paid version depending on your usage and stuff like that. But essentially what APIs allow you to do is they basically take care of all the stuff like geocoding, which is essentially converting an address into a latitude, longitude. They give you information. They give you a lot of tiles, so you can put really pretty applications. Like one of my favorite is ClearTrip. They actually have a very nice Maps API integration, which you can see the train routes on it and all that. So that becomes a very nice UI element for you to use if you were to use the tiles. So you have Tiles API, and besides all that, you have a bunch of Places APIs, which allows you to get access to more than 100 million listings that Google has in its index globally. So you can get information about that. But what I'm most excited about, honestly, is a new set of APIs that we launched at Google I/O this year, which are the Android location APIs. So I think that is really the future. We launched 3 APIs, which I think are really interesting. One of them is a Fuse location API, which I'll just talk about. The second is a Geofencing API, and the third is an activity detection API. So if you're building an Android app, you can essentially not have to worry at all about figuring out where the user is. You just make a call to the API, and it basically looks at the Wi-Fi signal or the GPS signal or the cell phone tower and kind of triangulates using all of these and gives you a nice, as accurate as possible location of the user. And then your job as a developer, as an entrepreneur is, assuming you had the information about the location of a user and had some context about the user, what is the app or the experience that you're going to build which is customized to that? And we'll talk about that a little, as we go forward. So that's the Fuse location API. The other one is geofencing. How many of you are familiar with the concept of geofencing? Okay, 30-40%. So essentially it's around being able to figure out where or kind of draw sort of a virtual boundary around the user. And then, so that's the fence, and you geofencing because you're basically using a geographical location, a physical location, and draw a boundary, and then based on automatically as soon as a user enters or exits that geofence, you trigger something in your app, and Android can recognize that. And a third one is activity detection, which is whether you're biking or walking or in the car, we have a pretty useful way using sensors. So a lot of the smartphones have a lot of sensors now. So we can kind of detect whether what mode the user is in. And again, if you're trying to build an outdoor app, you can actually use activity detection very easily to seamlessly show to the user when he's biking or hiking and so on, and kind of give a very targeted experience. So I think that is what is, we are going to continue to invest a lot in this, obviously, and this is something which is useful for developers, I feel.
Great. Maybe you can talk about some of the user size, user growth, geographies,
yeah,
stats.
So obviously, we have been investing a lot in Google Maps, and as I mentioned earlier, we've been at it for several years now. So it's actually reached a pretty interesting point where we now have more than 1 billion 30-day actives on Google Maps, and that's, it is just a number, but the thing is that the kind of closed loop information that we now have about being able to really target an experience to a user is something that we just have a lot of data points to work towards. We also have our driving directions launched in almost 200 countries now worldwide, and it's like 48 million kilometers of roads of driving directions. There are a lot of Easter eggs in Google Maps, FYI, if you guys are familiar with the concept of Easter eggs. So you can kind of do driving directions from weird places. So I will let you guys explore and do a Google search and find what those are. But, so we have that. The other thing that it's a big focus for us is transit. So one of the trends that we're seeing is there's significant growth happening, not in terms of usage alone, but in terms of just the kind of use cases that get enabled. Significant bias towards city-based systems. So earlier what used to happen was you build a map, right? You want to build a map of the entire country. Of course, we still do that. But there is a lot of innovation that's happening for city-based models. So, like there was a carpooling, app that was being discussed yesterday when we were at dinner. So, how can you solve the problem of people living in a city who can kind of come together and do something, right? So whenever you have city-based systems, transit becomes very important in most cities around the world. So we have like more than 1 million stops of transit in 800 cities. So again, these are things that we continue to invest in. Now, why is this important to you? Because you will get all this data as a developer or as an entrepreneur. You can kind of take that as a platform and then build your applications on top of it.
Got it. So let's move a little bit in the future and where new applications and services can come. So maybe talk about where is the innovation coming from? Is it coming geographically in different places? What platforms is it coming on? What about the enterprise? Is there any innovation going on there? What's new that people can go out and build?
So let's start with enterprise. So I actually read a very interesting stat this morning that if you look at the U.S., just the U.S. companies, all the U.S. companies, about 50% of the companies, their employees use some sort of a mapping or a geo application on a daily basis. So this could be, finding out directions. If you're a sales guy, if you're a logistics company, you do that. So more than 50% of the company employees use it on a daily basis. And this is the desktop product. Similarly, 36% of them use it on devices. So either on their smartphone or, GPS devices in car and so on. But only 5% of these employees actually have a suite available for themselves to kind of visualize and make decisions using data. So for instance, if you're a salesperson, right, and you have a bunch of leads that you want to target, it is very interesting to put those leads with those addresses and so on a map and kind of plan out what your geography should be. And there's something about, for people who have kind of done this, there's something visually very different about putting information on a map that just expands your decision-making process. So you can kind of cut and paste, and you can say, okay, I want to target the east side first, west side first, and so on. So only 5% of the users do that. So I think there is, again, just like it's happening in many, many industries, there's this consumerization of GIS or geographical information systems that's going to happen in enterprise, where just like a user wakes up in the morning and he checks his Maps app to go to his commute, when he comes to work, he would like to have a similar kind of experience. So we have Google has a few products in this. There are lots of companies doing this. So this is one space that I would encourage people to look at. How do you bring, really make the GIS services, which used to be really complicated, desktop-based, very client-server kind of architecture, how do you democratize this and make it available for a large audience? To a user who's sort of using this at home, they can kind of use the same thing at work and just make decisions. So that's the enterprise aspect. I mentioned the city-based approach. I'm seeing a bunch of startups that are using maps in very innovative ways in cities. Like one of my favorite is Uber, which is, again, it's a San Francisco-based company. They've launched in India also. It's essentially a limo sort of service which allows people to just book a ride. And think of it like, I don't know how many people have used Uber or apps like Uber. the experience on the user side is so amazing and so integrated. Like you open up the app, you see a map, you drop a pin, a car shows up. That's it. No calling anybody, nothing. You can see the car kind of, on the map, you can see the car navigating to your place, and, you can see all those kind of funny things. So it's fun, it's very engaging. Those are things that really excite me. So city-based models, how do you sort of scale that out? And let's talk about India in this context a little bit. I think one of the challenges that if you look at GIS data and just the whole geospace, what we call geospace in India, finding structured data is a very big problem, right? So for instance, if I were to ask you, can you find me a provider who can give me all the addresses in India, right? So all the addresses with their latitude, longitude. It's hard because, our address system is not address number 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1 and then suddenly it'll be 55 or, whatever. And the roads are often not named and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of demand, in terms of having this information organized and collected. And then companies like Google and there are other GIS companies, there are companies like Coca-Cola for that matter, I'm sure, who would love to know where to put their next bottling plant or where to next. So there's a lot of information that they're lacking today, and that's the opportunity.
Platforms. What about cars and other such
Yes, let's
things?
talk about Yes,
Yeah.
Thanks for that. So the other thing is, we already talked about, location and how important that is. Now, one of the things that I'm really excited about is the whole automotive experience. And in fact, there's a talk about that by the Reva CEO later on, which I'm hoping to attend, which is I really look at the auto as the fifth screen. So earlier, I'm sure you guys have read these internet jargon, like, there are 4 screens. I think that there are already 4 screens in our life, and auto is the 5th screen. So you have your laptop, you have your tablet, you have your phone, and you have your TV, and then you have your car, right? So the expectation of a user is, I want an integrated sort of integrated experience across these screens. If I'm sitting, just take maps as an example. Let's say I'm planning to go somewhere. I'm planning to go and eat some food with my friends, right? I'm going to a restaurant. So I start with my laptop, I search for something, and I find a restaurant that I like. I should be able to just close my laptop, pick up my smartphone, and just walk, and map should be right there. Exactly the same context where it was. I should sit in my car, I should power up my car, it should be right there. I don't have to type anything, I don't have to do anything. That's the kind of experience, integrated experience across devices that we need to build. It's really hard to build this, right? How do you store the state? Everything has to be connected. How do you kind of match the sessions and all that? I mean, those are technical details that you have to go into. But that's one area which I think there's going to be a lot of innovation because people spend a lot of time in cars. In fact, just this over lunch, I was talking to one of the gentlemen here. He was telling me that he uses Google Maps navigation turn by turn on smartphone. He's been using it for a lot of road trips, and he's been doing this for 5-6 hours. And he gave me a lot of good feedback, by the way, which I need to address. So I know I have my work cut out. But basically, his point was that more and more people are traveling, more and more people are taking cars, they're going for road trips with families. They would like to know where is a rest stop, where is a restaurant to go to. So those are things, build an in-car experience is actually very, very important. So that's one. And the final thing I would mention there is the whole concept of wearables. So Google Glass is one of them, but there are lots of other things that many companies are working on as far as wearables are concerned. So let me take an audience poll. How many times on average do you think people check their smartphones every day? Just some number. 200, okay. 100. Sorry? 100? Every day, yeah? One more guess. 1,000 times, okay. That's a power user. So on average, based on the research that has been done, it's about 150 times a day. Right? You don't wear your watch anymore. Everything is like every time you're standing, you're talking to your friend, you're kind of quickly taking out your phone from their pocket and seeing, oh, somebody sent me an email or Facebook status or whatever. So the fact is people check their phones more than 150 times a day. Now, so that's the reason why wearables like, glass or watch or whatever is becoming really important because that's just another way for people to kind of have this information shown to them in context. So for maps, what this means is, again, the information around letting people get around, finding the information, interacting with the real world, what is the information they can get, all that is integrated into these wearables.
Cool. So I think we'll stop there in terms of prepared remarks. Why don't we go to